My name is Josephine Carter. I'm 35 years old, a middle school music teacher, and for 11 years I believed one painful lie, that my grandmother had forgotten me. Every birthday, my younger sister Vanessa received something extravagant from Grandma Eleanor. Designer purses, tuition payments, a down payment for her boutique, even a silver Lexus on her 28th birthday. Welcome back to Shadow Family Stories. And me? A card. Always the same shaky handwriting. Thinking of you, Josephine. Love, Grandma. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. Grandma was older. Maybe she and Vanessa were simply closer. Maybe I hadn't visited enough after moving 2 hours away for work. But over time, things stopped adding up. Especially after Grandpa died. The inheritance he'd promised me, the college fund he mentioned since I was 16, vanished without explanation. When I carefully asked my parents about it, my mother's smile tightened instantly. Your grandfather changed his mind before he passed, she said. Dad nodded without looking up from his newspaper. That sentence became the soundtrack of my adulthood. When she dropped out of college twice. When she crashed 3 cars. When she maxed out 6 credit cards. When she borrowed money from relatives and never paid them back. Meanwhile, I worked 2 jobs through graduate school and paid every student loan myself. Still, I stayed quiet. Because in my family, questioning anything made you difficult. My parents hosted a family dinner for Vanessa's engagement. Her fiancé, Derek, arrived wearing a Rolex my father had apparently gifted him. During dessert, my mother tapped her wine glass dramatically. We have exciting news, she announced. We're helping Vanessa and Derek buy their first home. Everyone clapped. Then Dad added casually, we're using part of the family inheritance account. I froze. Inheritance account. Not was. Is. My fork slipped from my hand. What inheritance account? I asked carefully. The room went silent. Vanessa looked down at her plate. Mom laughed nervously. Josephine, not tonight. No, I said. Actually, tonight sounds perfect. Dad's jaw hardened. You already received your share years ago. I received nothing. That's not true, Mom snapped. Her face changed instantly. Fear. Just for a second. But I saw it. Dad stood abruptly. We are not discussing finances at the dinner table. Vanessa finally spoke in a tiny voice. Joe, just let it go. No. Her voice turned razor sharp. They stole from my granddaughter for 11 years. She pressed speakerphone. Dad answered on the 3rd ring. Hey, Mom. Grandma's face hardened instantly. Why did you steal Josephine's inheritance? The silence after Grandma's question felt endless. Mom, what are you talking about? Grandma didn't blink. I'm looking at the bank records right now. I watched the color drain from my father's face through nothing but silence on the phone. Finally, he said carefully, Josephine is sitting there, isn't she? Yes, Grandma replied coldly. And unlike you, she now knows the truth. Another long pause. Then Dad exhaled sharply. This isn't something to discuss over the phone. His voice hardened instantly. Oh, then explain it, I said finally. My father went quiet again. And in that silence, I realized something terrifying. There was no explanation. Only excuses. Dad tried anyway. You were always independent, Josephine. Your sister struggled. We intended to balance things later. No one stole anything. You forged transfers from trust accounts. Dad's breathing became heavier. Then came the sentence that destroyed whatever remained of our relationship. We are still your parents, he said sharply. Everything we did was for this family. I laughed bitterly. No, everything you did was for Vanessa. The line disconnected. He hung up. But beneath my anger was grief. Because even then, Part of me wanted my father to call back and say this was all a misunderstanding. He never did. Instead, 37 minutes later, my mother called, crying, "Josephine, please don't do this to the family." I stared at the phone in disbelief. "I'm sorry. We were wrong. Just, please don't expose us. You lied to me for 11 years. You don't understand." "No," I interrupted quietly. "I finally do." Then I hung up too. 3 days later, Vanessa showed up at my condo unannounced. She looked awful. Mascara smeared. Hair unwashed. Designer coat wrinkled. For once, she didn't look like the favorite child. She looked terrified. "I need to talk to you." I almost shut the door. Almost. Instead, I let her in. For 10 full minutes, she paced my living room saying nothing. Then finally, I didn't know at first. I crossed my arms. At first, she burst into tears. "When Grandpa died, Dad told me they were borrowing from your share temporarily because my tuition payments were overdue." "How temporary?" She looked down. "And after that?" More silence. Then she whispered, "It just kept happening." I stared at her. "You watched them steal from me for 11 years. "No." Her voice cracked violently. "I kept asking Dad when he'd tell you. He always said he would eventually." I laughed once. A horrible sound. "You bought a Lexus with my inheritance." She started crying harder. "The car was already purchased when I found out where the money came from. But you kept it." That sentence landed hard. Because she had no answer. "I'm jealous of you." I blinked. "What?" For the first time in my life, I saw my sister clearly. Not as the golden child, but as someone raised to believe love had to be earned through obedience. Vanessa sat trembling on my couch. "They controlled everything," she whispered. "What I wore, who I dated, what I posted online. Dad even approved my engagement. And the money?" Her face crumpled. "That was how they kept me dependent." Suddenly the pieces clicked together. They hadn't just stolen from me. They had trapped Vanessa too. A week later, Grandma invited the entire family to dinner. No one wanted to attend, which meant everyone came. The atmosphere inside Grandma's dining room felt radioactive. Dad barely looked at me. Mom kept forcing fake smiles. Vanessa looked seconds from vomiting. Then Grandma stood slowly from her chair. At 82 years old, she somehow still commanded the room better than anyone. "I have an announcement." Dad immediately stiffened. "I have officially removed Richard and Linda from power of attorney, estate authority, and all inheritance oversight." Mom went pale. "Mother, I'm not finished." Grandma adjusted her glasses. "From this day forward, Josephine will oversee my estate." The room exploded. Dad stood up so quickly his chair nearly fell backward. "This is ridiculous." "No," Grandma replied calmly. "What's ridiculous is stealing from your daughter." Mom began crying immediately. Vanessa stared at the floor. Then Grandma delivered the final blow. "I've also hired a forensic accountant." Absolute silence. Dad's face lost all color. Because now it wasn't family drama anymore. Now it was evidence. The forensic accountant uncovered everything within 3 weeks. Hidden transfers. Fake educational expenses. Unauthorized withdrawals. The total stolen amount was higher than we thought. $417,000. I nearly threw up hearing the number aloud. Dad kept insisting it wasn't theft. Our daughters benefited equally. The accountant simply slid another document across the table. Only Vanessa's name appeared on the payments. My lawyer looked directly at my parents. "This qualifies as financial fraud." Mom started sobbing instantly. "You'd really destroy your own family over money?" I stared at him in disbelief. "You destroyed this family 11 years ago. Then my lawyer asked the question nobody wanted answered. Would you like to settle privately or proceed publicly? Dad finally looked afraid. Vanessa's engagement party was supposed to be elegant. Instead, it became a public nightmare. Because halfway through dinner, Derek stood up unexpectedly and returned the engagement ring in front of everyone. I can't marry into this. Gasps filled the ballroom. Vanessa looked shattered. Dad exploded instantly. You ungrateful little. Stop, Derek snapped. I found out where the house money came from. Every guest went silent. Someone at another table literally whispered. Vanessa burst into tears and ran from the room. Mom chased after her. Dad turned toward me with pure hatred. This is your fault. I shook my head slowly. No, it's yours. A month later, Grandma asked me to help clean Grandpa's old attic. That's where we found the box. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Addressed to me. Every birthday. Every Christmas. Every major milestone. Unopened. I sat on the attic floor crying so hard I couldn't breathe. Grandpa had written things like, "We're proud of the woman you're becoming," and "One day this family will make sense again." Grandma cried beside me. I never knew they kept these. But the worst discovery came last. A sealed envelope labeled. Inside was a cashier's check for $25,000, dated 9 years earlier. The legal settlement negotiations dragged on for months. Dad became increasingly unstable, calling nonstop, leaving furious voicemails. Then one night he appeared outside my condo screaming. Neighbors watched from balconies as he ranted in the parking lot. Finally, he shouted the truth no one expected. You were never supposed to need the money. Silence. I stared at him. What does that mean? His face changed instantly. Like he realized too late what he'd admitted. Mom pulled him away before he answered. But later, Vanessa told me the truth. When I was younger, my parents assumed I'd marry wealthy someday because I was the smart, pretty one. They believed Vanessa would always need financial support more. So they justified stealing from me. Like I was an investment expected to succeed anyway. I don't think I've ever recovered fully from hearing that. 6 months later, the settlement finalized. My parents were forced to repay a large portion of the stolen inheritance by selling properties and liquidating investments. Dad retired early in disgrace. Mom stopped attending social events entirely. Vanessa ended her engagement and started therapy. And me? I finally began rebuilding my life. One quiet afternoon, Grandma and I sat drinking tea on her porch when she smiled softly. You know, she said, your grandfather always said you'd survive all of this. I laughed gently. I didn't feel very strong. You answered the phone, she replied. That's where strength started. A few weeks later, Grandma passed peacefully in her sleep. But before she died, she changed one final thing. Her obituary. The last sentence read, "To my granddaughter Josephine, thank you for finding your way back to me." At the funeral, nearly everyone cried, including my father. Not out of anger anymore, out of understanding. Some people spend their entire lives protecting lies, and others survive long enough to answer the phone that finally tells the truth. The church was still full when the woman approached me. Grandma's funeral had ended 20 minutes earlier, but clusters of relatives lingered near the stained glass windows, whispering in hushed voices. Outside, rain tapped softly against the chapel doors while funeral home staff folded chairs in silence. I stood alone beside Grandma's photo arrangement, emotionally drained beyond words. That's when I noticed her. A tall woman in her 60s wearing a navy coat and pearl earrings. I didn't recognize her, but she clearly recognized me. You're Josephine, she said carefully. Something about her voice felt familiar. Yes. Her eyes softened instantly. I'm Margaret Holloway, your grandfather's sister. I blinked in surprise. Before I could respond, she handed me a thick cream-colored envelope. Your grandmother asked me to give you this after the funeral. Privately. My pulse quickened immediately. Why privately? Margaret glanced across the room toward my parents. Because Eleanor didn't trust them. That answer told me everything. I waited until I got home before opening the envelope. Inside were three things: a safety deposit box key, and a photograph I had never seen before. The picture showed Grandpa standing beside a much younger version of me at age 6. I sat on his shoulders laughing while he held a massive cardboard sign that read, Future CEO. Tears instantly blurred my vision. Grandpa used to tell everyone I would run the family business someday. Not Vanessa. Me. Josephine. If you are reading this, then I'm finally with your grandfather again. There is something your parents never told you. The inheritance was never only money. Your grandfather intended for you to inherit controlling ownership of Carter and Sons development after Richard retired. He believed you were the only person in the family with integrity strong enough to protect it. That is why your father feared you. The documents are inside this safety deposit box. Love always. Grandma Eleanor. I stopped breathing halfway through the page. Controlling ownership? Of the company? Dad hadn't only stolen money. He had stolen power. And somehow, Grandma had just handed it back. I barely slept that night. By 8:30 the next morning, I was standing inside First National Bank holding Grandma's key so tightly it dug marks into my palm. The bank manager personally escorted me downstairs to the vault. Take your time, Miss Carter. When the heavy steel door closed behind him, silence swallowed the room. Inside sat a thick leather folder bound with fading straps. The moment I opened it, my stomach dropped. Stock certificates, corporate trust agreements, legal correspondence, and one document highlighted in yellow. Transfer of majority shares upon retirement of Richard Carter. My father. According to Grandpa's signed agreement, once Dad retired, 51% ownership of Carter and Sons automatically transferred to me. Not Vanessa. Not both daughters. Me alone. I sat frozen. Because Carter and Sons wasn't a small business. It was a regional construction empire worth millions. And my father had hidden that fact from me my entire adult life. Suddenly another document caught my attention. A notarized letter from Grandpa dated 3 months before his death. I stared at the page in disbelief. Grandpa knew. Somehow, before he died, Grandpa already suspected Dad might try to cut me out. My chest tightened painfully. He had tried to protect me. Then I found the final document. A memo from the company's attorney. Richard Carter has repeatedly requested amendments removing Josephine Carter from succession structures. Requests denied per founder instruction. Repeatedly. For years. My father hadn't made one bad decision. He had spent over a decade systematically trying to erase me from the family legacy. By the time I left the bank, I felt physically sick. But I also felt something else. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt dangerous. 3 nights later, Dad appeared at my front door. Alone. No anger this time. No yelling. No arrogance. Just exhaustion. When I opened the door, he looked 20 years older. I need to talk to you. I should have shut the door immediately. Instead, against my better judgment, I let him inside. You found the documents. Not a question. I crossed my arms. Yes. He rubbed both hands over his face. Then finally said the one thing I never thought I'd hear from him. I made mistakes. The words sounded foreign coming from him. But even then, something felt wrong. Fear. You stole from me, I said quietly. I was protecting the company. I laughed in disbelief. There it is. His face tightened instantly. You don't understand what your grandfather built. No, I replied coldly. You mean what you built using his money. That landed hard. Then he finally admitted the truth. When your grandfather started talking about making you successor, investors panicked. I blinked. What? You were 23. Young. Female. Emotional. Emotional. You know what I mean. No, I snapped. I really don't. Dad stood and began pacing my living room. The board trusted me. They knew me. But if ownership transferred to you, everything became uncertain. So you stole my inheritance to weaken my position? I stared at my own father like a stranger. You destroyed my relationship with Grandma because you were afraid of losing control. His eyes filled with tears then. Real tears. But they didn't move me anymore. Because finally I understood something devastating. Dad never saw me as his daughter. He saw me as competition. Vanessa called me at 2:14 in the morning, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. Can I come over? 20 minutes later, she arrived wearing sweatpants and no makeup, clutching a duffel bag. I left home. I stared at her in shock. What happened? She collapsed onto my couch. Dad lost it. Apparently, after learning I possessed the succession documents, Dad became obsessed with controlling the damage. He monitored Vanessa's phone, read her emails, demanded updates about my conversations with her. Then earlier that night, he crossed a line neither of us expected. He told me if I testified for you, Vanessa whispered, I'd be cut out permanently. I felt ice spread through my chest. Testify. Vanessa nodded slowly. The company lawyers want statements. Of course they did. Because now this wasn't private family betrayal anymore. This was corporate fraud. Vanessa looked up at me with swollen eyes. I spent my whole life trying to be the daughter they wanted. My anger softened slightly. Vanessa. No, let me finish. She wiped her face shakily. They never loved me either, Joe. They controlled me. The room fell silent. For years, I'd believed Vanessa had everything. The money, the praise, the attention. But sitting there looking at her trembling hands, I realized the truth. She had been raised like an extension of my parents' ego, not a person. And suddenly, for the first time in our lives, we weren't enemies anymore. The Carter and Sons board meeting happened on a gray Monday morning in February. I wore Grandma's pearl necklace beneath my blazer like armor. The conference room overlooked downtown Chicago, all glass walls and polished steel. 10 board members sat around the massive oak table whispering nervously as I entered. Dad was already there. He looked furious. You shouldn't be here, he hissed. I calmly placed Grandpa's succession documents on the table. I legally belong here more than anyone. The company attorney cleared his throat. Today's meeting concerns pending ownership transition and allegations of fiduciary misconduct. Translation. For nearly 2 hours, financial investigators presented evidence of diverted trust assets connected to company accounts. No one interrupted. No one defended him. Because the documents were overwhelming. Finally, the board chairman turned toward me. Ms. Carter, are you formally asserting succession rights under founder agreement? My heartbeat thundered. This was the moment Grandpa planned for. The moment Dad spent 11 years trying to prevent. Across the table, my father stared at me with desperation, rage, and fear all tangled together. But as a man terrified of losing the only thing he valued more than family. Control. Then I answered. Dad slammed his fist against the table. You have no idea what you're doing. I stood slowly. No, I said calmly. You just never expected me to learn.